Well, hello and welcome to Insight of Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Donald Trump's pivot to Putin is supposedly meant to draw Russia away from China, but the sounds from the White House are also unclear when it comes to backing American allies across the Pacific. The ramifications for the region could be huge. Joining us, we have Latika Burke, a London-based correspondent who specialises in geopolitics, national security, defence, as well as Australian and British politics. Hello and welcome, Latika.
G'day.
Great to have you with us. I'm going to jump straight in. This is the second of two talks we've run on what we call the end of the West and the enormous ramifications of Donald Trump's nationalist agenda. We're going to start with the Asia-Pacific area, but we will talk more generally about the dilemmas faced by all of America's allies. Just to start with, Latika, can you outline Trump's statements so far about the region, his guarantees given or not given to his allies, and his stance on China?
Yes, I think this is the big unknown question that we have still about Trump 2.0 as opposed to Trump 1.0. What's becoming really clear is that Trump 2.0 is far more vindictive and capricious towards Europe. What we don't know yet is how vindictive or capricious he might be towards China, and subsequently, given the treatment that we're seeing of his friends and allies in his own patch, such as Canada, we're not quite sure yet if the Indo-Pacific is going to be quarantined from that because of the need to contain China, or if allies in the Indo-Pacific are just as indispensable as well. And there's a couple of allies that I would say are very, very anxious. Japan, Australia would be two of those. Korea, obviously, because it hosts US troops. And then, of course, you have the strategic relationship with India, which is something that we might come back to. At the moment, I would say the fear is that Trump 2.0, just like Trump 1.0 when it comes to Europe, is actually going to be radically different, and that he could invite President Xi Jinping into a negotiation where they essentially carve up spheres of influence in the world. America retreats from the world stage and says, you have your bit, Xi Jinping, to hell with Taiwan, possibly. Russia looks after Europe, or Europe can look after Europe, whatever, we don't care. And as long as we're okay here in the United States and we're going to restore our manufacturing base, that's really the priority. I would say that is the huge fear. Trump is doing nothing to allay that fear. What we do see is, again, this bipolar, and chaotic approach within the own administration, because you have very confusing signals sent out by various people. So Pete Hegseth, for example, the defense secretary, is very pro a US presence in the Indo-Pacific. He's very pro-AUKUS. He's very pro-Quad. Same with Marco Rubio. But then you don't have that same confidence emanating from President Trump. In fact, he seems to view the relationship with China purely through the economics, as opposed to stability of the region. And stability, this is really important, stability of global or common norms that would actually lift the safety, security, and prosperity of that entire region. So these are things still to be decided. I'm yet to land on where I think he will land, but at the moment, I would say the signs are not good.
Okay, but just in terms of what he's done, tariffs on Europe, Canada, and Mexico, they seem to sort of come and go day by day, week by week. But those tariffs are 25%, whereas China just is at 10% on the previous 10%. Okay, that comes to 20, but he seems to be slightly more generous on the economic side.
Yeah, 10 plus 10. And notice that Xi Jinping has been quite restrained in his response back to the United States, which again can be read as the two of these superpowers actually preparing the ground for a deal. Now, a deal would not be necessarily favourable to the United States allies, if indeed it's even favourable to the United States. And an early indication of this is look at what Donald Trump has done with TikTok. Now, TikTok is a Chinese-owned social media platform. It's been a bipartisan view under the former Biden administration, but very strongly shared by Republicans, I might add. In fact, some of the most prominent hawks on this have been Republicans. And they believe that TikTok poses a security threat to US national security. They ordered that TikTok be divested of its Chinese ownership or it faces a ban. Now, one of Trump's first acts was actually to reverse that or say that he's going to try and find a deal. Now, he still has some time to secure this deal. We don't know exactly what's going to be in it, but all the mood music coming out is that he desperately wants to save TikTok and retain a partial, if not controlling stake for the Chinese Communist Party in that. That's not a good sign. And that, I think, is really a good indication point of how we should be assessing where Trump will go, because there's two very key differences here. Personnel is absolutely critical to understanding why Trump is a little bit different, maybe massively different, TBC, on China compared to the first time. First time he came in understanding and having, I think, driven a fault line about what China represented in terms of a strategic and economic threat. But he had very strong allied-focused China hawks in that administration. I would say Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, former CIA director, was one of those. A couple of his former national security advisors, with some who, of course, he's famously fallen out with, John Bolton being the most high-profile, Robert O'Brien in there, and Matt Pottinger, who's also been helping drive this TikTok ban. Matt Pottinger was the deputy national security advisor. So these personalities have not been invited back into Trump 2.0. And I think actually that is the missing piece, or that is the explanation for why Trump is behaving so much more differently this time around.
Some kind of deal with China isn't a new idea. You can go back to the Obama administration, go back even earlier than that, when foreign policy analysts have talked about the so-called G2 deal, this idea of economic cooperation between the world's two global powers. And you can understand how that might work on a geopolitical form. But the issue here is that it comes without any guarantees for American allies in the region.
Well, we're also so further along the curve. That's really the big critical point to make here. China has played a long game. It has outfoxed the United States and its Western allies on critical technologies, particularly when it comes to green technologies. It's outfoxed the West largely on telecommunications. And as I was saying before, now they've got a genius, a bonanza in TikTok, so they can wage cognitive warfare on that if they so choose. And there is some evidence that that is perhaps what has been going on in countries like Romania, for instance. So it's naive, and I think the most generous take, to think that any sort of deal that Trump could strike would favour American interests long term. We know that Xi Jinping uses the short-termism of Western governments, particularly when we have a new sort of short-termism. I mean, sometimes the Trump position can last a few seconds. It can be a tweet between a tweet. It can be hours. It can be days. But there's not exactly a long-term kind of framework to how Trump operates, let alone Western democracies. So I think that would be hugely naive. But let's wait and see. Let's wait and see. We do have some very strong China hawks in the Pentagon, and they have said that Taiwan is something, for example, worth defending. But I would just make this point. Last week, the week before, a fleet of Chinese warships did a big lap around Australia. They conducted live firing exercises without warning the New Zealand and Australian government that they were about to embark on these exercises. Now, these were conducted in international waters, so they did nothing illegal. But it is unprecedented for them to have come this far south. It is unprecedented for them to have lapped Australia without warning us. And guess what the Trump administration said about this? Nothing. So I think that really does say a lot. Silence says a lot. And that silence, I think, should be sending a chill through a lot of people who were hoping that the Trump administration would come good, perhaps even better when it comes to containing China and stabilizing the Indo-Pacific. It sends a chill, I think, that perhaps just maybe, unless this is about American interests in terms of dealing with China, you could be on your own. That's a very frightening thought.
That you've highlighted a key point, which is the inconsistency, how unreliable the US position has become. But against that, you've highlighted the consistency of China's position, which is, I mean, you've described some very assertive, very aggressive actions. China, the People's Liberation Army, the Navy going around Australia. We can think about routine exercises off the coast of Taiwan. But by and large, isn't China's power exerted in form of trade, and trade that people don't want to relinquish?
I mean, in an ideal scenario for China, what they would do is have vassal states made out of most of the Indo-Pacific. And that just simply means, look, we'll trade with you. You just shut up. Don't get in our way. We probably won't get in yours. But if you do, here's a warning shot. Here's something we could do to make your life miserable. We saw that during the COVID pandemic when Australia, under the former government, announced that they would like an inquiry with weapons inspector-like powers to go into China and start investigating what caused COVID. And China took great exception at this and launched about $18, $20 billion worth of economic coercion on Australian goods. And that really caused suffering for those sectors that China decided to hit. Now, Australia is not immune. China has done that to many other countries. Lithuania is a good example for their stance on Taiwan. They've also been putting the Czech Republic, for instance, in the freezer for many years. Now, interestingly, as of the Munich Security Conference, unfreezing Czech Republic. So they are always playing two steps ahead. And yes, it is not in their interest to need or want to try and invade their neighbours. I mean, the idea of China trying to invade Australia or hold it is ridiculous. But what that shows, what they did with that lap around Australia is say, look, just by the way, all your defences you positioned in the north of the country, we could get you in the south if we wanted. So maybe it's just better you don't say anything for a while. And there is evidence that this policy and these tactics work.
Let's focus a bit more on Australia. There are many people watching who are Australian, so perhaps this will be evident to a lot of them anyway. But just what was the reaction in Australia to that terrible meeting in the White House with Zelensky, Trump and Vance? And then how have the two parties, has Prime Minister Albanese and the Liberal Party leader Peter Dutton handled it since?
So we were meant to have gone to the election campaign yesterday. I'll be back in Australia as of Saturday for the campaign, which is now delayed. So it'll be starting in, I think, the end of the month for May 3 election. Put that in your diary. Look, really interestingly, the approach towards Trump, I think, has been somewhat concerning. At the start, of course, everybody was like, we accept and endorse Donald Trump's mandate for change. Australia did quite well under Trump 1.0. And so there's a bit of confidence. I think it's very misguided, and I think it's a mistake that we will get through the second Trump administration in the same way. And the reason I think it's a mistake is for all and some of those reasons I was outlining about Trump's approach towards China. That is drastically changed. And a good example of this is tariffs. So Australia was hit in Trump 1.0 with steel tariffs. We got an exemption. Now, Trump 2.0 has come back and said these tariffs are going on everyone this time. No exemptions, no carve-outs. And Australia, I think, is hoping, wishing, praying, but putting its head in the sand at the same time, thinking, well, we got through on the first one by just saying, look, we have a trade surplus with you. No need to hit us. I don't think that's going to cut the mustard. This second Trump administration has come out very doggedly saying, actually, Australia, we think you are a third-party re-exporter on behalf of the CCP and we're not taking it. Now, that will be a big blow. And that will be a first kind of failure of this government to achieve anything significant out of the Trump administration. So that will play into the election campaign. Interestingly, on the Zelensky meeting, what we are seeing is Labor taking a very timid, cautious, I would almost argue frightened approach towards Trump. I think there is a sense that as long as we just say nothing, put our head under the doona, that's an Australian word, I think it's quilts that you would say, as long as we can hide down here in our corner of the world and just don't offend anyone, don't rock the boat, we might ride this through. It's an understandable approach to take, but it's deeply, deeply misguided. And I think it's about to bite Australia really badly. The opposition, interestingly, has been a little bit stronger. So Peter Dutton is a very unpopular sort of opposition leader, but is amazingly doing a lot better than people thought, to the point where they're competitive and this election is up for grabs. And he has said, actually, I would have told Donald Trump that he's wrong, that Zelensky is not a dictator. And that was a very different position to the one that Labor took. Labor certainly obviously came out and said, no, we support Zelensky, we support Ukraine. But they weren't as that emphatic and dogmatic in saying we'd actually take this fight to Trump personally. I think this dynamic is going to play out in the election in a way that, and I almost think we had a cyclone over the weekend, which is why this election was delayed. And I think Labor may come to regret that, because I think the longer that the Trump administration causes chaos, and we will know the effect of the steel tariffs by then, it is going to play into whether somebody as our leader can be strong enough to deal with the Americans in the way that we'd like. But there is also a risk, because the right side of politics, Peter Dutton, he has, sorry, my cat's just jumping up here. He has also said, he's also proposed, I think he lent in quite early when Trump looked like he was doing some more popular things. He's announced his own Doge, some copycat tactics that really Australians don't love, the importation of US politics. And so now I think you're going to see a campaign where it's the coalition, the Liberal right-wing Tory party saying, we think you're weak. We think you're not strong enough to deal with Trump. Let us do it. And then you're going to see Labor saying, well, you look a bit too much like Donald Trump, this person that we wouldn't have nothing and not have a bar of in our own politics. So let's thrash it out. So I'm actually very, very excited to cover this campaign, because it's up for grabs and there's a lot at play and a lot at stake.
Well, we'll hold that thought about how populist or more nationalist parties are playing the Trump position, because previously all the politics were relatively aligned, but now Trump's come out with this ultra-nationalist agenda. Maybe they're in a tricky position. Let's come back to that thought in a bit, particularly in reference to Europe as well. But I do want to stay with defence and security. AUKUS, the Australia, UK and US Defence Pact, is obviously key to Australia's sort of defence strategy. Where does that lie now?
I think this is the big unknown debate that we're having, the big untold debate that we're having. And I think it probably will blow open after the election. Right now, neither side wants to blow it up. Look, at a foundational level, AUKUS looks pretty safe. So we have let's just recap what AUKUS is, by the way. AUKUS is a program for Australia to buy nuclear-propelled submarines from the Americans. Then Australia and Britain are going to co-design a brand new class of a nuclear-propelled Astute class submarine. So that would be called HMAS or HMS AUKUS. Now, it's a grand plan. It's huge. It's costly. It's the most expensive defence capability Australia has, and it's critical because Australia has let this capability gap grow and grow and grow to the point now where we are at the window of where Xi Jinping might move against Taiwan, and we've got rust buckets for submarines, and we should have had better submarines in the water 10 years ago, if not earlier. So it's been a bit of a disgrace in Australian defence policy and procurement, but nevertheless, we are where we are. And now our entire security depends on the United States making good on this agreement. The good signs? Well, Pete Hegseth, the Defence Secretary, had his first counterpart meeting with Australia's Defence Secretary. Pete Hegseth came out of that saying, we actually want to ramp up shipbuilding. Thank you very much, Australia, for sending the first cheque. It was $500 million US. It's a huge sum for a country like Australia on one procurement project. So we've sent the first check over, and now it's a case of when we'll get those submarines. They're due around the early 2030s. So look, this is long after we would think Donald Trump has been and gone from the White House. But what are the concerns here is that Bridge Colby, who's number 2 Pentagon pick, has been a big skeptic of AUKUS. In fact, I asked him a question here in London mid last year, and he said, look, I would not have signed away the crown jewels of our defence technology if it had been me in the Pentagon. Then he went on to illuminate, of course, the well-known strains on the US industrial base, which no matter how much political will is there, can't be wished away. So there's a lot of factors that could jeopardise this. In Australia itself, it's a bipartisan supported project. It was proposed by the former coalition, so the right-wing government. It has been endorsed by the Labor government, but the heart is not so much in it. We all kind of know Labor would not have proposed this if it had been up to them. And so there is, I think, a coming debate where the AUKUS critics, who are largely anti-American and favour closer relationships with the CCP and believe that Australia's future is in Asia, and by the way, we should not be the 51st state. Sorry, Canada, that might make us the 52nd state of the United States for our defence capability. These arguments, I think, are going to go like hotcakes in the next 6 to 8 months as Australians, depending on what Donald Trump does. But if he keeps up this behaviour, Australians will start saying, hang on, why are all our golden eggs, not just our eggs, why are the golden eggs of our security and our biggest defence spend being put in a basket where the owners are destructive? They love getting baskets of eggs, throwing them around a room, smashing them up, and then wondering, marvelling at the chaos they cause, and everyone is shocked. Well, that's the kind of Republican Party we have now. And if that is the way they treat Australia, AUKUS, I think, is going to be, at the political level, maybe a problem. And that's something that would have to see whether it actually endures this administration and can ride that stormy sea out.
Yeah, those thoughts echoed in Britain too with Polaris, with Trident. Just the idea that we can rely on the United States as a long-term defence strategy, I think is for the birds. Let's have your questions, please, everyone. If you're watching, you can either put your questions in the Q&A box, so you can put your question directly to the TICA, or just raise your hand. There's a hand button there you can click as well. I mean, the fundamental question there that you implicitly raise is this about Trump? Is this about Trump and Vance? Is this MAGA? Is this the Republican Party? Is this the United States?
Yes, and I think this is really what a lot of leaders are looking around the world very anxiously wondering and waiting to know the answers for. And I think, I actually agree. There's a lot of caution going on with leaders, and I don't want to see leaders running off with their mouths if they don't have to. There's just no reason to upset this guy. Look at how he treated Zelensky over not so many things. And we just had a kind of strange incident in Australia where Malcolm Turnbull, a former Prime Minister, made very uncontroversial remarks, simply saying that the way Trump's behaving will pull ASEAN particularly closer to China and make some others think twice. And Trump's Truth Social account tweeted a really savage attack saying Malcolm got everything wrong on China, and it was just kind of weird and historical and personal and bitter, as Trump is wont to do. So this, I think, is a big question, but I think we will probably already start to answer it. And this is a big concern, I think, for the sensible Americans who are not saying much at the moment, particularly in the GOP, but also the Democrats who have a stake to get their act together and sort this out and be a credible alternative by midterms. Because I think whereas the pandemic was this point in time where the world said, gee, we might just need to start rebalancing. We've had this decoupling idea in the United States and everyone thinks that's about their superpower rivalry. We don't want to go that far. That would literally be bananas for our economic growth. But maybe we do need to rebalance. And then you saw that in the European-led strategy of de-risking, which was then adopted by the G7 and many other countries, including Australia. Not that Australia is de-risking, by the way. But I digress. But I think the main outcome of what's happening now is that, yes, it is having and achieving these shock methods. It is achieving results in spurring Europe back to life, which is a great achievement for Trump to leave. If he departs the presidency and he has revitalized the European project, wow. I mean, he wouldn't have intended it, and it's not what he wanted, but that's a pretty significant legacy to leave. You're seeing Europe rearm. You're seeing them do radical things like in Germany remove the debt brake to borrow to fund defence spending. You're going to see, I think, the UK do something similar. They've announced 2.5%, but it's clearly not going to be enough. They're going to have to raise defence spending much sooner, much faster. So it's either got to be through more debt or it's got to be through raising taxes. So watch this space. But I think that's a big argument in the UK. But there's going to be a lot of money washing around. And it's going to, I think, find a very unfriendly audience if these American defense companies start knocking on the door of European capitals, start coming back to the UK and saying, hey, well, you've got all this money, let's buy our missiles, let's buy this and that. And I think that the European, and I do think Australia will be live in this, and Japan and Korea as well, and India, by the way. I think there will be a conversation had behind the scenes about actually, what do we do to de-risk or diversify or rebalance away from American defense procurement. And Elon Musk, I would say, is accelerating that sentiment more than Trump himself. The noises he is making about wanting to kill off NATO, about threatening, almost tacitly suggesting, hey, I own Starlink and I could cut the Ukrainians off from that. The actions we have seen from the United States in cutting off intelligence already and depriving them of military aid, that is going to lead, regardless of whether this is just Trump's first 6 weeks, regardless of whether this is a MAGA bloodstream thing that gets exhausted out of the system once Trump departs the stage, regardless of whether J.D. Vance tries successfully or unsuccessfully to continue the MAGA candle, or it's somebody else, you will absolutely see a rebalancing of defence procurement at the very least from Europe, I think parts of the Indo-Pacific, and definitely in the United Kingdom.
You speak to people, some of the same people we speak to and visit on our tours, I know that. And I just want you to describe some of the shock of the reactions of what's happened in the last 2 weeks. And I suppose the point is that even if Vance and Trump are not around for a long time, people are going to have long memories. I mean, that a line has been crossed.
Yeah, I think the Zelensky Oval Office showdown was just one of those turning points in history that I think we all recognized it at the time when we were watching it, because, I mean, I know myself, I watched that about 6 times, and it was physically painful to keep watching and listening to. And every time I watched and listened to it, I heard something different that Trump had said. And I thought, oh, hang on, that's really frightening that he's saying that. That's a Russian line, or this is his true intent. So, yes, I do think that was a big turning point. I think it crystallized in the eyes of foreign leaders exactly what they were dealing with in a way that no other encounter had. And I think at the public level as well, I mean, this is just a very anecdotal story, but I was in a sauna the other day, and a girl not working in the media at all started talking about it. I mean, when it cuts through to normal people like that, and she was shocked. She was saying, I don't think we realize what's happened. What's just happened? Why did he do this? I think the shock at the public level is matched at the shock of the political level. But where I think it's different is there are some political leaders who are acknowledging what's happened, and they're often racing. I would put Keir Starmer in that basket. I would put Friedrich Merz in Germany in that basket. Macron, I think, is just waiting for the day when everyone says, see, I was right all along. So there's definitely some leaders here who are taking the initiative and adapting. And then I think there are a bunch of very complacent leaders who I think are dangerously in a position where, and I come back to Australia and what I said there. And I would actually also argue India is showing signs of this same complacency, at least publicly, that nothing has really changed from their end, that we'll all be good. And in Australia, we call it a she'll be right culture, that it's all going to be fine. So I think, yes, there was shock, but I also think there has been more of a realistic readiness to adapt and move on and try and shape what comes next than we might have expected.
Great. Listen, let's bring in some questions now. We've got John R. I think I know where John R. is. Go ahead, John. You just need to open your microphone and put your question to Latika. Your microphone's probably in the bottom left. There you go, John. Go ahead.
Hi. One can't help feeling that President Trump is a Russian asset, and there's been a lot in social media about it. Not that there's any direct evidence, but virtually, well, everything is done. Do you think Trump, if there's any reality to this, do you think Trump might also be working against Southeast Asian countries' interests through his activities so far in Southeast Asia?
On the question of whether Trump is a Russian asset, I think we've almost come to the point where it's inconsequential if there's direct evidence, because his own actions are exactly what a Russian asset would do. I mean, the Kremlin could not be happier with the huge changes that are being orchestrated. And this is the dream. I mean, Dmitry Peskov said this himself last week. He said the US foreign policy configurations are changing at such a pace and in a way that largely aligns with our vision. So I think that's all you really have to take from this. We can spend all our time, and I've read all the same articles as you, and I think a lot of them are becoming more and more compelling. But at the end of the day, let's just look at what Trump is doing. Is he trying to cleave America away from NATO? Yes. I mean, I personally think Article 5 is up for testing, and I'm not really sure that the United States will come through. And if that's the case, NATO is, as we know it, dead. Is Trump an enemy of the European Union? Does he hate the European Union? Does he hate that project? Does he wish it didn't exist? Would he like to deal with smaller, weaker countries rather than a big, powerful bloc that's second biggest in the world and he thinks is out to screw him? Yes. Guess who else thinks that? Vladimir Putin. I mean, we are seeing a Russian playbook being played by the White House, just not the Kremlin. On the question of how that operates in Southeast Asia and China, I think it is a little bit different in terms of ideology, because what we cannot also deny is it's not just Trump. There are large portions of MAGA that genuinely believe the Russian lines. They genuinely see this Christian world or this way of society that Vladimir Putin has projected out to them as more desirable. You know, in their minds, Vladimir Putin is the warrior against woke, the warrior against trans, the warrior against a lot of this DEI and LGBTQI rights going too far, as they see it. And they want that sort of society in their order. You don't have to dig too deeply to find the parallels here. I think with China, that is not the case. I think MAGA genuinely, and there are huge sections of MAGA actually diametrically opposed on this. So, for instance, a Steve Bannon is very, very different towards China policy than Elon Musk. But for where MAGA has an ideological opposition against China, it is along the lines of China deindustrialized us without us really realizing what was happened. We're now being swamped by their cheap goods. We've lost working class jobs. We've lost working class votes. This is an unfair system. China cheated their way to superpower status. They're now in a position where they could rival us. They could now beat us with their military potentially, although I don't think they would right now. And that is the ideological underscoring of how they approach that. Now, your question about what that means for Southeast Asia, I don't actually think they are strategizing that far down the track. I think it goes back to what I said earlier, which is America first isn't America first and then the rest. We have to get America first out of our heads. America first is America only. And be damned the rest of you, you know? That is a very, very different way to think about what they are doing. And once you put it into America only, it all begins to make sense, doesn't it? You know, yes, Trump's worried about China, but only for so much as it matters to American economic interests. Trump matters about Russia, not about Europe. He wants to stop the fighting so he can get back to business with Russia. I mean, that is what America only is. And that is not an isolationist America first approach. And this has been a big, I wrote a piece about this actually during last week. This has been a big misconception we've been holding about what Trumpism is, about what MAGAism is, about where the GOP is, and by the way, about where the American public is, because these are not isolationist policies. It would be actually more favourable, perhaps, to us all if they were. This is destructionist. This is deliberately taking a torch to what's left of the world order and saying, we are going to load this with the kerosene and set fire to the rest of it, because this, in our view, America's view, has not retained our supremacy, and we want our supremacy back. And if supremacy means doing a deal with Xi to get him off our back for so long it matters to us, getting Russia off Ukraine's back, or Ukraine off Russia's back, I should say, so that we can do business with Russia again, hey, sounds good. Do we really think that Trump is that interested in freedom of navigation? Do we really think Trump and MAGA care about world trading rules? I mean, these guys are junking these very systems. They don't care at all. They care so much as only it preserves and shores up American might.
Great points there. Let's take a question from Deglan, who's in Dublin. And this comes back to the role of personalities in the administration. I don't think that Donald Trump has a big ideological framework. I think it's a lot more basic than that, as you've just been pointing out. But this feeds into Deglan's question. Go ahead. Deglan, you just need to open your microphone. Bottom left-hand side, probably, of your screen. There you go.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Very informative and thought-provoking. You spoke about China and the Trump administration having a kind of a economic, financial courtship, if you like. Is there a financial dimension, economic dimension to the more amiable Russian-US relationship now that is I mean, I can remember, when Russia was heavily investing in London, for example, is it, from what you're saying with Trump and his MAGA people, it seems to be the money, rather than, a world order that, a better world order or whatever. And while I'm at it, can you just tell me, how did Elon Musk become so important, and what does he actually have a title, or is he just hanging around?
Let's deal with Musk first, because I think we've dealt with the first bit of your question a bit already.
Okay,
go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah, Musk does have a role. I mean, he is head of a newly created quasi department. It's not an official department of government efficiency, Doge, which is actually after a meme, believe it or not, a Dogecoin. That's how it all started. Did he become so important? Well, it's money. I mean, he's the biggest financial donor and backer of Trump. He runs now not just, sorry, Chloe, come down. Sorry, she normally doesn't do this. I'm very sorry. He's the biggest donor to Trump. He owns a media company, which he skewed very much in favor of Trump during the campaign. I'm not saying that wins or rigs elections. I'm very reluctant ever to say that. I think narratives are only supported for so much as they're real. But did we see X change and boost right-wing accounts and pro-Trump accounts? We absolutely did. Now, that's not the same as saying that it rigged or changed an election. So I'm not saying that. He is somebody that Trump, as somebody who was once a former chief of staff, I won't say which one, to Trump, told me, he's the one person Trump cannot afford to offend. And I think we are seeing that play out, actually, because even with the official appointees having these reported rows with Elon Musk, so Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, for instance, has clashed with him, what does Trump do publicly? He comes out and defends Elon. Now, inside MAGA, there is a lot of jostling and unease about Elon Musk. Steve Bannon, who I mentioned before, who's kind of the ideological warrior, advised Trump in the first administration, went to jail, runs alt-right media with his podcast. I mean, he is diametrically opposed to Elon because Musk backs worker visas, for a start. Musk also has his Tesla cars built in Shanghai car factories. And you'll notice that one thing Musk never talks about when he rails about free speech in Britain, when he rails about free speech against the left, he never talks about free speech in China, does he? Not once, never. So I think there's an amount of capture that is over Elon Musk as well in terms of China. And going back to your Russia point, one of the things to note when Marco Rubio released his first statement after the first meetings with the Russians about setting up Ukraine peace talks, I think these were held in Saudi. The final point of that readout from State Department was we're looking forward, I'm paraphrasing here, but the vibe was we're looking forward to restoring, what business and economic ties we can do. So yes, absolutely. To answer your first question, the administration wants to be back doing business with Russia. Now, we haven't yet talked about the reverse Nixon or the reverse Kissinger here, which is this theory that is commonly, put about by right-wing circles that there's a grand strategy here. We're not just pro-Kremlin. We're not just Putin puppets. We're not just shills for Moscow. We have a grand plan, and the grand plan is that by bringing Russia back into the tent, we peel Russia away from its newly found relationship with China. And of course, now that's growing to encompass also Iran and North Korea in loose but not alliance or any formal affiliated ways. There is, I think, a few flaws with this theory. One, Iran, China and Russia are holding naval drills as we speak. So, if there's any sign that Russia's about to be peeled away from China, it wouldn't be doing naval drills, would it? And also, you would think the Trump administration would say, hey, while we're negotiating this, like how we put the really tough word on Zelensky, how like we deprived Ukraine of the military aid, we stopped their satellite access, we've cut them off from intelligence to try and get them to the negotiating table and actually really want a deal. Well, we would like to say to you too, Russia, maybe don't do these military drills. It's not a good idea while we're trying to actually bring you back into the tent and rehabilitate you. But no, that doesn't get said, does it? So I think, again, you have some really clear contrasts here that often actions do speak louder than words.
Let's take one more question. Tim Ripley, who works with Jane's Defence, so he knows a thing or two, is going to ask us a question. But Tim, keep it short and tight. And I think your question should go way beyond.
Quick, right. Very interested in your comments about the Australians, Japanese and the Brits, the Europeans standing up to the Americans and reorientating defence production orders. This is what the world I work in. But there is a whole multiple generations of military officers, defence procurement officials, spies, civil servants, all these people in all these countries who are in utter denial. They cannot imagine that their best friends are Americans. They cannot work it out. And is not drastic action needed against these people to purge them, to make them realise which side their bread's buttered on?
Tim, you can't, let's have a debate here. I'm jumping in here. You can't purge them. That's everybody's been through Santa.
I'm being purged. Maybe I'm being rhetorical here, but
also, and then let's just think about GCHQ. Let's just think about SIS, the whole defence security apparatus in the UK and across NATO has been built entirely with cooperation with the Americans. Dismantling this is generational. It's huge. Can't be done in just a few years. Latika, your thoughts?
I don't think we will see a systemic breakup of Five Eyes, for instance, or anything like that. I think that's actually where the mood will prevail, that we just ride this out, that this is a moment for America and that these allied intelligence, particularly when it comes to Five Eyes, has lasted so long and endured so much already, we can see it out. I actually did ask a former MI6 officer chief about this last week, and the answer was very much, this is the one bit where it will be steady. I think it remains to be seen, and that's a question I'll certainly be asking on intelligence, whether the rest of the Five Eyes are happy to share, quite frankly, some of their intelligence with Tulsi Gabbard and Donald Trump. I don't really think Donald Trump is reading intelligence. As for defence procurement, look, I'm not talking about big radical shifts in existing programs and things like that. I even think probably AUKUS will outlast this moment. and we will proceed with those sorts of submarines. And I don't think we'll be going back to the French, for instance, or anything like that. But where I do think the opportunity arises is twofold. Let's have a look at the actual composition of the coalition of the willing. But my guess is it's going to look a lot like JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force. So not NATO, but two NATO nuclear powers. And it will potentially encompass, the Australian government has already said we're willing to contribute to this mission. Once you start grabbing in Canada, you start grabbing in Australia, maybe we could see some other Indo-Pacific countries in New Zealand for what it's worth, but, it's symbolic and it's important and it matters in that respect. They've also said they'd like to be involved. So I think once you actually get a coalition of the willing together, then some exciting things are going to start happening. And I really look at this in terms of the innovation, not the big jet fighter planes. I'm not talking about subs here. I'm not talking about, the big programs and missiles and things that we're going to start building in Australia. What I am talking about is future drone capability, for example. I'm talking about some of these smaller programs where we could be very creative. And I do think the British will be leaning heavily on the Australians to say, come over to our side of this AUKUS technology sharing arrangement, which, as you know, Tim, that's what AUKUS is. It's basically a giant free trade military agreement. It's not a security alliance as much as some people like to think it is. It's not. And so I think you will see the British and the French trying to really woo some of those Indo-Pacific countries. GCAP, I think, is an outstanding example of where future defence collaborations could be on future innovation. And I think that is actually going to happen regardless. I think the current programs, particularly the biggies, obviously no one's going to be taking a knife to them because Tim, as you know, they're so expensive, they're always over budget and they're always late anyway. But the future is what I'm looking at. And as warfare and our weaponry becomes more innovative, I think this is going to be an area of collaboration. And by the way, I'd also add satellites to that. I think there'll be a big debate about Starlink, about dependence on US tech and US satellite and space. So they are the kind of areas I'd be watching for. I personally am not a huge fan of purging. I'm not sure who you're exactly wanting to purge. But I think
purging. I'm not talking about purging. What I mean is,
you used that word in your question. You did use the word.
Okay. In Britain, for example, there's a big argument about whether we should buy GCAP or more F-35s. And there is a whole cadre of officers in the RAF who are completely enamoured with everything American. And they are trying to buy F-35s, which will dry the budget for GCAP and kill the programme. Yeah. So that's what I mean, that these people are a fifth column that are sabotaging our independence.
Okay. I mean, there's a lot in that. I would say that's where the politics will matter. I speak to a lot of MPs who are very interested in defence procurement, and you, of course, have British MPs on your side with this argument. They would absolutely be supporting GCAP. And GCAP is going to get its own momentum in this climate. The more Trump... GCAP is a new fighter jet being proposed by Japan, Italy and Britain. And the more that the Trump administration behaves like this, and I think this is what the Trump administration is, by the way. I don't think this is a bump or a glitch or a mistake or an accident. I think this is the true heart of what we're seeing. So expect more of it. It's necessarily going to create the conditions where the politicians will have no choice but to respond to that, and choosing wisely on defence procurement and diversifying will be massive. And by the way, those attitudes have existed in the politics long before this. There's always been a very strong streak in British, I'll definitely say left-wing politics here, not to buy automatically American. Look at what we can do with Europe. Look at what we can do with the Germans. GCAP's a great example. And also, of course, 100% British made where we could.
And to look at the other side of that, look at Turkey, for example, whose foreign policy interests repeatedly do not align with the United States or the rest of NATO's, yet it buys US fighter jets and US equipment left, right and centre. So it doesn't necessarily, maybe Turkey's box is clever and they can get away with it, but the other countries manage to buy the kit and not comply, as it were. Latika, where's your cat gone?
She's down next to me. Sorry. She doesn't normally run in front of the TV, in front of the Zoom screen. I'm not trying to go viral, I promise.
Okay, excellent. Listen, it's been fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. You've covered all those questions brilliantly well. We've really enjoyed it, and we hope to have you back again very soon.